glad that you're joining us for the Barnes & Noble YA Book Club discussion of I Killed Zoe SPANOS. I am Kit Frick, author of the book, and I will briefly introduce myself. I am a young adult thriller author. I'm joining you today from my home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And let's see, what do you need to know about me? I am the pet parent to 2 cats and a Chiweenie who may or may not be making an appearance during this virtual event. My favorite way to unwind is cooking and listening to true crime podcasts, which will come up later in this discussion, I am sure. And my latest obsession is Schitt's Creek, which I was very late to joining the party for, but now my husband and I are binging all the seasons on Hulu. And I'm delighted to be joined today with my friend and critique partner, Karen M. McManus, and I will now turn things over to her so she can introduce herself to you.
Thanks, Kit. Hey, everyone. I'm Karen M. McManus, and I, too, am the author of young adult thrillers, including the One of Us is Lying series, Two Can Keep a Secret, and The Cousins, which is coming in December 2020. So I have known Kit for probably about, 5 years now? I think we met when we were both querying writers, didn't have agents, definitely didn't have any books published. And nope. We were, applying to the same contests, right? Like the same writing contests. And we started exchanging work. And I thought, okay, this one's going places. I like her style. So it's really exciting for me to be here today to know that Kit's latest book, which I love, is the Barnes & Noble YA Book Club pick. And now we get to talk about it.
This is so fun because Karen and I don't live in the same city. We've never been able to do an event together before, although we have met in person and been able to attend events sometimes together. But this was such a fun opportunity to get to actually do an event together.
Yes, one of the little silver linings of our virtual world is that all these events are now online and we can be more flexible about who we get to present with. So really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about this book. I read an iteration of this book when Kit was first working on it, and I loved it right from the beginning. And one of the things that struck me about this book was that it opens with a bang. And it is not a spoiler to say, because it's right here in the title, the lead character opens with a confession. She's telling the reader, as well as, her audience within the story, that she killed Zoe SPANOS. So to kick us off, Kit is going to read from a little bit from that first chapter and also tell us why you decided to set the scene that way.
Yes, so I'm going to read a really brief excerpt from that opening chapter. Before I do that, I just want to say for everyone joining us, I know many of you have already read the book, which is amazing, but some of you haven't. So we're going to keep this discussion spoiler-free. It is a thriller, and we don't want to give anything away if you haven't yet picked up I Killed Zoe SPANOS. And if you haven't yet, I will start by just giving you a really brief pitch for the book. I've been telling everyone that I Killed Zoe SPANOS is YA Rebecca set in the Hamptons.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about both of those things too. When Anna walks into the Heron Mills police station and confesses to playing a role in the death of local teenager Zoe SPANOS, she is charged with manslaughter and concealing a body. But Anna's confession is filled with a few holes. And Martina Green, who is the teen podcast host of Missing Zoe, isn't satisfied. So the question becomes, did Anna really kill Zoe? And if not, can Martina's podcast uncover the truth? So I'm going to read an excerpt, which is actually 2 really short excerpts that I have stitched together from the end of the novel's opening chapter, just to set the stage for The story. So in this scene, Anna is in the Heron Mills police station and she is being interviewed about the death of Zoe Spanos by Detective Holloway. And Anna has come voluntarily to the police station, walked in and said, I've remembered things. I think I was involved in this death. So here's a little bit from the ending. I'm going to read for about a minute. Tell me about how Zoe fell, Detective Holloway says. Zoe and I were on the balcony. I remember twirling, our arms crossed in an X between us, holding hands. We were twirling and laughing, and it was fun until I started to feel sick. I think I let go of her hands. You think? You need to be honest, Anna. The detective's words slice the air. Anna flinches just slightly. I remember she hit the balcony rail. It was too low. Her knees buckled, and then it was like she was flying. Cut the pretty language, Detective Holloway snaps. Just tell the truth. She fell backward onto the lawn. Something wild dances in Anna's eyes, then fades, her pupils sinking once again into dark, exhausted circles. And then you found a boat for Zoe? Detective Holloway asks. Her voice is a song now, the jagged edge smoothed away entirely. Maybe I thought it's what she would have wanted. Maybe I was trying to make things right. Make things right? The detective repeats Anna's words back to her. In some small way, after what I'd done. It was an accident, but I killed Zoe Spanos. Okay, and Karen asked how this scene sets the stage for the rest of the story. So I Killed Zoe Spanos is written non-chronologically. There are two timelines, the past and the present. And this confession is the hinge point between the two timelines. So we have the past timeline where Anna is working as a nanny in Heron Mills. And that's in the summer leading up to this confession. And then we have the present timeline, which takes place in the fall following the confession when Anna is incarcerated in a juvenile detention center in Brooklyn. So the confession is really right in the middle of the story, but it takes place right at the beginning of the book and poses a lot of questions.
That's how you do it, right? That's how you hook your reader in the very first chapter. Like, okay.
What's going on?
Now I need to know what's happening here. So what was the inspiration for Zoe Spanos?
So when I had the idea kind of bumbling around in my head, I had just read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, the classic romantic thriller, classic, one of my favorite novels. I just read it for, the fifth or sixth. I don't even remember how many times I have read this book. And I was also listening to a lot of true crime podcasts, which I do, one of my favorite hobbies. And it occurred to me that when the title character, Rebecca, goes missing, the mystery of her disappearance, part of the reason it remains such a mystery is because that book takes place far before the 24-hour news cycle, the era of podcasts, etc. So her disappearance is allowed to remain a mystery probably much longer than it would today. So I couldn't help but wonder, what if a character like Rebecca, a affluent, well-liked woman in a society town, went missing now during the true crime podcast era? How would that story unfold? And so then I thought, okay, now let's make it YA. What changes do I want to make to this inspiration text to make the story YA? And also, where should it be set? And Rebecca is set in this beautiful seaside suburb of London in the UK. And so the natural answers seemed to be the Hamptons. I was living in Brooklyn, New York at the time when I was writing I Killed Zoe Spanos. I'd been living there for a bunch of years. And the Hamptons is, of course, right there, but also kind of a world away. Yeah. And so it seemed like the natural setting for this reimagining of Rebecca. The book does not follow the plot of Rebecca at all. I don't call it a retelling because it's really an entirely different story, but it did take its inspiration from Rebecca, and there are all sorts of little Easter eggs and milestone moments that if you happen to be familiar with Rebecca, you'll recognize them in I Killed Zoe Spanos. And if you're not, it doesn't matter at all to the reading experience.
Right.
But yeah, it was a really fun way to play around with a classic text and tell completely my own story, but borrow some of the things that drew me to loving that text in the first place. So yeah, that was the inspiration. Rebecca, True Crime Podcasts, and the Hamptons.
Put them together.
Yeah, put them all together.
I love Rebecca also. In fact, it somewhat inspired the cousins too. So I'm like a big Rebecca fan. And one of the things I like the most about it, yeah.
I'm so excited.
Did I tell you that?
No.
In a very specific way, which I'll tell you offline because it's extremely spoilery. But I love that part.
You have to wait to read.
Yeah, sorry about that. We get another 4 months for that one. But one of the things I love most about it is, of course, the atmosphere. And that's what I love about ZOE Spanos too. I really felt as I was reading it, it's very descriptive. Your language is very poetic. If you don't know, Kit is a poet, and you can see that in her prose. It's very beautiful. And I really felt like I was there. There it is. See?
I have that right there. So
just happen to have it. So I really, found myself immersed in this world, and I could picture it. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you went about like creating that setting and how you envisioned this fictional town? And also, did you go to the Hamptons for research while you were doing this?
Yes and yes.
Yay.
So yeah, I got to take the most fun research trip. It was just a day trip. But as I had mentioned, my husband and I were living in Brooklyn at the time, so we were able to just leave early in the morning and drive out. And I had been to the Hamptons before a couple of times, but there were some specific towns in the Hamptons and some specific sites that I wanted to get down some like textural details. I felt like I knew the Hamptons like in a broad sense, but when I'm researching for a setting like this, I like to really take notes of like what things smell like. I like to take a lot of pictures that aren't just like, this is the beach, but like pictures of building architecture and, little things that will turn into details in the book. So I did get to take that great research trip. I got to have a lobster roll for lunch, and I got to go to the beach, and I got to call it all book research, and it was the best.
Nice.
But yeah, so the town of Heron.
I did the thing for the cousins also. I went to Nantucket for that. And I do very similar. I take pictures of, like the path, so that when I'm describing someone walking the path to the ferry, I know what they're seeing, that type of thing. So yeah, I
took pictures of a lot of shingles on houses because there's like some specific architectural details that I wanted to get right. People probably think I'm like, I've lost my mind taking like these little like
getting right in there. Yeah.
Right. But
I mean, I feel like some of the descriptions, especially of the houses, because of course this is a very wealthy place where Zoe disappears from and where Anna is living for the summer. So it's very luxurious surroundings, very beautiful architecture, very well maintained, and that all came across beautifufully.
Yeah, I really wanted to get at, I think that we broadly as readers have a kind of fixation on bad things happening in seemingly perfect, and I say perfect in quotes, places. And of course, perfect is in quotes because nowhere is perfect. And our definition of what perfect means is often affluent and white and all sorts of things that are very problematic in terms of that definition of perfection. But when I was developing the town of Heron Mills, it's fictional, but it's very closely based on real towns in the Hamptons, like East Hampton, Amagansett. They go to Montauk, which is a real town on the very east end of Long Island during the course of the book. And so for developing atmosphere, I wanted to both get at the luxury and the seeming perfection of this town, and then also create this really creepy, atmospheric, gothic feeling, because something really terrible has happened here. A local teenager has disappeared, and not a spoiler because we learn this in the very first chapter. Her body is discovered. She is in a boat submerged in a lake right there in the town. And so I was inspired by, in addition to Rebecca, also Grey Gardens, which there's an amazing documentary that is filmed at the estate of Grey Gardens, which is located in East Hampton. And so I was in the estate of Windermere, which is right next door to where Anna is nannying, was inspired in part by Grey Gardens and, in part by the Manderley estate in Rebecca. So it is gothic and creepy, and there are birds and a high balcony, and
the wildlife is taking over.
The wildlife is moving in. So yeah, the setting was very fun to write.
Yeah, well, it came across so well. It was one of my favorite parts of the book. And another favorite part was your characters. So the story is driven by two young women. One, of course, is Anna, who we've already talked about. And then there's Martina, who has the podcast that is investigating, what happened to Zoe and what Anna's involvement is. And so tell us a little bit about the character of Martina. She's a young woman. She's doing this podcast sort of all on her own. She's got, just personal interest in seeing this story through. So what drives her? What's her goal throughout the narrative?
Yeah, so Martina is the best friend of Zoe's younger sister, Aster. So she has a very personal investment in Zoe's disappearance. She wants to find out what really happened to Zoe when the police initially, before Anna confesses, as I mentioned, the book is non-chronological. So her podcast begins recording before Anna's story starts taking place. So the police initially write Zoe off as a runaway, and Martina does not buy that explanation for what happened to Zoe. And then, of course, when Zoe's body is found and Anna confesses, she also finds a lot of discrepancies in Anna's confession and doesn't believe that that is the correct answer either. So her podcast sets out to discover what really happened to Zoe. She wants to get justice for Zoe's family, specifically for her best friend, Aster, and also for Zoe's parents, who she is also close with. And she feels that as a local and an insider, she has uniquely what is needed to get to the bottom of Zoe's disappearance, because she realizes that the police investigation is really focused on one theory, and then on a different theory when Zoe's body is found. And they're not looking at the big picture. They're not looking at the context, what Zoe's life was like around the time she disappeared. They're not speaking to all the people that are in Zoe's life that maybe had nothing directly to do with her disappearance, but might know information that turns out to be important. And so she's determined that she's going to conduct a whole different kind of investigation from the one that the police police are doing. And so you get her, the transcripts of her podcast narrative interwoven throughout the book. So they're interspersed throughout the past and present timelines.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting, because one of the questions I get sometimes is, well, how do you, sort of write this teen protagonist who doesn't have the skills of an investigator? How can they, solve a crime that the police can't? And I think you hit on it with just, she understands the social fabric of Zoe's life, better than anybody. And that's something that teens understand very well is, sort of the motivations and the relationship structures of their peers. And Martina really puts that into play very, very well as she's sorting through the evidence.
Yeah,
and she also has a podcast, which is one of your favorite things. So how fun was that to write?
It was so fun. It was the most fun. And I want to note that Martina doesn't conduct a perfect investigation. As you noted, she is a teenager and she does mess up. She does cast suspicion on some people without thinking about the full scope of the consequences. And, she's not a polished professional, not that polished professionals don't mess up too. But, she has a good heart, though, and that's what ultimately carries her through. But yes, the podcast transcripts were so fun to write because I do listen to so many of them. I listen to a ton of true crime podcasts. I also listen to a lot of podcasts about writing, and I love This American Life. I listen to a whole bunch of podcasts. So it felt like I got to dabble in a whole new genre when I was writing these podcast transcripts. It was like I was working in the podcast medium, except without actually having to investigate a crime, which I would be terrible at and should never do. But
professionals.
Yeah, right. I will leave that to the much more dedicated amateurs like Martina and the pros. But it did really, it made writing those podcast transcripts easy and fun because I just had like all the stylistic stuff in somewhere cataloged in my brain from having listened to so many. So I really didn't have to do any podcast research for the book because it was just like taking an obsession of mine and creating my own.
And what's your favorite podcast, true crime, if you had to pick just one?
Oh my God, just one, Karen? That's so cool. I guess my absolute favorite, which I've been recommending a lot recently, but for good reason because it's so well done, is an investigative long form podcast called Bear Brook. And it came out a year and a half ago, maybe. It's a New Hampshire public radio production, and it is set on the outskirts of Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire. And the podcast opens with the discovery of 2 unidentified victims in a sealed oil drum that has been kicked over in the woods. And then there's another barrel discovered, more unidentified victims. There is a serial killer. There are other crimes that are out on the West Coast. Like the story becomes this very complex web involving genetic genealogy and just all sorts of really amazing things. And it's really thoughtfully reported. And it's this amazing story that is groundbreaking in the research used to eventually identify the victims. And it's just like, it hits all the notes for me.
Oh, that sounds amazing. All right, I'm going to check that out. Let's talk a little bit about...
Yes, I just said everyone listen to Bear Brook. It's so good.
Yeah. Yes, if you take one thing away from this, besides that you need to read ZOE SPANOS, it's listen to Bear Brook.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the role of memory in this book, because it's a psychological thriller, of course, and our lead character, she's got some issues with trying to recall what exactly happened to Zoe and what her role was in that. So how did you kind of construct that internal thought process for her, and what kind of research did you do?
Yeah, so I Killed Zoe Spanos is both a murder mystery and a psychological thriller. And as Karen mentioned, memory plays a really big role in the psychological aspect of the novel. So part of it was research and part of it was just lived experience thinking about memory. One of the reasons that I love writing about memory, and it's a sort of continued fascination of mine, is that, you know, typical people with typical cognitive functions struggle with memory all the
Yeah.
time. It's not something that is, you can have all sorts of uh, things that seem like they might be like flashy or atypical memory experiences that are really just part of regular human experience, because memory is such a slippery thing. So I did do some research into memory. I had actually done a lot of research for another book project that did not end up going anywhere, but I had all this memory research that was then in my back pocket that I was able to apply to this novel. There are all sorts of interesting studies and more like entertainment focused research into the intersection between memory and crime that I find really fascinating. Eyewitness testimony is, I believe, the number one reason that criminals are convicted of violent crime. Don't quote me on that. I cannot tell you now where I got that statistic, but I feel like I have heard it. It sounds right. I feel like I've heard it many times on many podcasts. It's at least a large contributing factor to criminal convictions. Yeah. It's also one of the biggest, I think second only to DNA evidence. It is one of the largest reasons that convictions are overturned, because eyewitness testimony so often turns out to be false. And this isn't all, sometimes it may be because people are flat out lying, but often it is because what we deeply believe we remember turns out to not be true. And so this is not a book about eyewitness testimony. Anna directly believes that she participated in Zoe's death, which may or may not turn out to be true. But what I will say is that her memories of the event are suppressed until the point of her confession. And then when they do bubble up for her, once Zoe's body is discovered, what she recalls and what actually happened, it becomes clear, do not match up. So the question is she lying? Did what she do, was it actually a lot worse than what she tells police? Perhaps it was murder and not an accident. Or if she is lying, why is she lying? And what has contributed to her believing what she believes? So digging into that was really, really fun, because I often, I think about memory all the time, because there are so many times just in daily life where, for instance, my husband and I will remember completely different, remember the same event completely differently, or and it's not, we are people with typical cognitive function, and yet, and maybe this is something that only happened last week, and yet his version of events and my version of events do not add up, and it's frustrating, but it also speaks to how slippery memory can be, and also how we can really passionately and fervently believe in our version of events, and then occasionally when something comes along to prove us wrong, and we know we're wrong because something else has intervened to show us that, it's really startling. And
shocking.
Yeah, it pulls the curtain up on something that we really passionately believed. So yeah, I would say there was a little bit of research, but also just a lot of dabbling in my own experience of memory.
It was really well done. And, you know, as a reader of thrillers, I sort of pride myself in being able to tell where things are going, just because I've written them too, and I like to think I can guess what's a clue and what's not a clue. It was really hard in this book. You had a lot of red herrings that I fell for. So can you talk a little bit about just, you know, how do you misdirect the reader, or how do you build suspense and keep them, you know, looking in lots of different directions?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really rely on are my critique partners like you, Karen, and you especially, because you are my thrillerista critique partner. Or, you know, when I'm getting early reads on a thriller, something that I'm really asking for is, tell me what you're thinking at this point. Like,
Yeah.
what do you think about this character? What do you think is a clue? I like to have the reader's sense of things so that I know if what I'm trying to do is actually working or not. So one thing that's really important to the process for me is working with critique partners and working with my agent and working with my editor on getting a sense of early responses, so that I know if what I'm trying out is hitting the right notes or going completely off the rails. So I do incorporate a lot of clues and red herrings into my novels. And one way that I keep myself organized is I like to create what I call kind of a story map at the beginning. It's essentially an outline, but it's very bare bones. I usually only give myself like a sentence or maybe two sentences about what's going to need to happen in a chapter to advance the plot. And then I leave myself a lot of room for discovery during the drafting process. But what I will do is I'll note, like, throw suspicion on this character, or introduce this clue here. And then I will keep track as I'm actually drafting. I'll keep referring back to this story map / outline. And I know that, you know, if I was casting suspicion on a certain character in chapter 4, I need to develop that thread again in chapter 6 and maybe, you know, shift things or like double down on that. So I'll use that as a tool to keep track of all of my little intricate things as I go. And it also then helps when I do draft and I invariably diverge from my outline, or, you know,
Sure.
develop something that is much more detailed than I had initially envisioned for that chapter, I'll make a note if I introduce a red herring or a clue in a chapter on the outline, so that it's like a living document as I'm writing and I can keep referring back to it. Yeah.
Similar. I love hearing other people's processes. It's so interesting.
What do you do?
I have kind of like this outline, you know, like a living outline, and it has it's actually an Excel spreadsheet, because I'm not actually that visual of a person. And it has all these different columns, and it actually has stuff like clue, you know, in one column. And so chapter by chapter, and I'm like, did I put something in there? You know, did I put something in there? So, and I try to, it's really bare bones at the beginning, and a lot of times I build it in after. You know, I'll look at this outline and I can tell pretty quickly, you haven't done anything to misdirect anybody in a very long time. So why don't you figure out how to do that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, mine's not in Excel, it's in Scrivener, but it sounds like we have kind of similar processes for working with like the what it should be document and the draft and what it actually is. And it's like they're checks and balances for each other.
Yes, and eventually it becomes much more detailed. So I have a couple more questions for you, and then I think we can start taking some audience questions. Last one related to your book is about the timeline. So as we've already talked about, there's like dual timeline, there's past, there's present. How do you go about keeping that straight? Did you write the book, like, you know, in order? Did you do timeline by timeline? How did you manage that?
Yeah, I love this question because it's evolved so much for me over the course of writing the 3 thriller novels that I've published. So my first book is See All the Stars, and it is also in 2 timelines, and it is a strictly alternating past and present narrative. And when I wrote See All the Stars, I wrote the entire past timeline and then the entire present timeline, and then I wove the 2 together in revision. And it was a complete nightmare that I don't want for anyone. It was my first novel, and I could not envision how to write something that happened in the future until I'd written what happened in the past. And I think it was the way that I needed to write that book because that's where I was in my writing process. But I set up such a huge challenge for myself in revision because there were no natural transition points between any of the chapters. It didn't flow. There was no flow. And so it was a giant challenge on the back end to kind of retrofit a natural connectivity into this narrative. And so at this point, with my third novel, which is in 2 points of view, 2 timelines, and a podcast, I just like to keep making things harder and harder for myself. But I have learned to rely on that kind of bare bones outlining that I was talking about to allow me to write the book in the order in which the scenes will appear in the novel. Instead of trying to do everything in the past, the whole podcast together, etc. I can't imagine writing this book in that way. It's more like a puzzle, and I need to fit each piece as I'm doing it, and then it all kind of comes together. But yeah, it's a combination of outlining and then relying on the magic that happens in drafting to make that into something that is actually a living thing.
Yeah, it's kind of alchemy sometimes, isn't it? You're not sure what's going to come together, and then it does.
Yeah.
All right. Last question. What are you reading right now?
Ooh, okay. So I recently this week I got 2 amazing pieces of book mail, which I will show off to you. So one is Today, Tonight, Tomorrow by Rachel Lynn Solomon.
So cute.
Yeah, it's so good. I actually got to read an early copy of this book a bunch of months ago. It is now the next Barnes & Noble YA book club pick, so everyone needs to pick this up as well. It's a really delightful rom-com centering Jewish main characters. It's a rivals to lovers story. It's amazing. And then I have not yet read, but just received This Is by America, which is the debut crime novel by Kim Johnson. And I know that this is something that you just finished reading as well, because I just saw it on your Instagram, and I can't wait to dive into it. Yeah. And before I ask you,
I know you're gonna really enjoy that one.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to read. It's been on my most anticipated list for a long time. I nearly got to do an event with Kim a bunch of months ago, I think when the book had just been newly announced, but it didn't work out, but hopefully sometime in the future, and I can't wait to read. And then I also just want to quickly recommend 3 books that are coming out this fall that I got to read early copies of. I want everyone to add to their TBR for fall YA thrillers that are forthcoming. I have a September book, which is Throwaway Girls by Andrea Contos. And then, yeah, it's all 3 of these are amazing. I got to read them early. I got to blurb them. They're all totally aces, and they're all available for pre-order now. In October, I Hope You're Listening by Tom Ryan is coming out. It also features a teen podcaster, and it is awesome. And then Those Who Pray, and that's Prey by Jennifer Moffat. This is a debut novel, and it's coming out out in November. Also a thriller. It is set on a college campus. It is culty. It is great.
Ooh, that sounds good. That sounds really good.
So tell me more about what you're reading or what you are recommending right now, Karen.
Yeah, so of course I did just finish This Is My America. It was amazing. Loved that. Another book I finished recently is not out yet, but it's coming out in September, which is Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. If you're not reading Tiffany, she's like a queen of young adult thrillers. She has 3 previous books. They're all amazing. And this is her 4th book, and it's just so incredibly well done. Total page turner. It's coming out September 15th, I think. So definitely want to check that out. I'm also reading The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, which is coming out September 1st. And Jen is this amazing mystery writer, and she started writing, I think, when she was 19 years old. So she has so many books out, and they're all so good. But this might actually be her best. I really, really enjoyed it. And the last thing I'm reading is More Than Maybe by Erin Hahn, which is out now. So that's one people can actually pick up. And this is not a thriller. It's an adorable contemporary romance, which is a really nice palate cleanser for me.
Yay. Yeah, that also looks so cute. I can't wait to read it. I need more romance and more rom-coms to mix in with my thrillers.
Right?
And yeah,
you just need a break.
Right. I mean, I feel like those are my 2 escapes. It's like thriller or love story. You know, give me either. And like just co-signing on everything that Tiffany D. Jackson writes. I'm so jealous that you got to read Grown early. All of her books are amazing.
Yeah, she's the best.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we can take some questions if people have them.
Yes. Yeah, we would love to answer some of your questions.
The first one is, did you base any of the characters off people you know?
Oh, I did not. No. In fact, even for this novel, even I can't even say that some of the characters are like composites of some real life people, although that is true for a couple of characters in past novels. But one really fun, unexpected highlight of writing this novel is connecting with all the ZOE SPANOSes of the world. It turns out there's many of you, and you all found me on social media, and so now
you killed them.
I know. So that has been a really funny and fun, unexpected perk of publishing this book.
Oh, that's hilarious.
It's not any of you, but I love knowing you're out there.
Are you going to revisit any of the characters in this book in a new story?
Maybe. I don't have any specific plans for a sequel or a spinoff yet, but I definitely have ideas.
I feel like you could continue with Martina, you know, like that's pretty good basis character for lots of stories.
Yeah, I feel like she has lots more stories to cover and investigations to dive into. So I would say it's a definite possibility.
Yay. I, for one, am pleased to hear that. What are you working on now?
Oh, okay. I think I'm going to make this a question for both of us because I'm sure that everyone wants to hear what you're working on now as well, Karen. I am just starting on my 4th young adult thriller which is also going to be coming out through my publisher, Simon & Schuster McElderry Books. And it is in the very early idea stages. So unfortunately, I can't really give you much of a preview yet, but I can tell you there will be another YA thriller forthcoming from SNS. Yeah. So keep your eye out for that in the future. And Karen, what are you working on now?
So, of course, I'm getting ready to launch The Cousins in December, which seemed really far away until August hit, and now I'm realizing it's not that far away, so that's coming soon. But then after that, my 5th book is coming out at some point in 2021. That's already been announced. It's called You'll Be the Death of Me, and it's another standalone young adult mystery. I call it Ferris Bueller's Day Off meets a murder mystery. And that one is in like the editing process, you know, so it's like close to done, but it's not really at a point yet where there's any advanced copies floating out there or anything like that. And then I'm just starting to think through ideas and write some sample chapters for my 6th book, which I hope will be out in 2022. We'll see.
You are so prolific. I love it. And yeah, You'll Be the Death of Me. I got to read a really early version, and I can't wait to see how that book is transformed and get my hands on the final when it comes out. But The Cousins is first, so very excited. Yeah.
All right, and I think we're getting close to time when we're running out, but let's take at least one more question. What kind of advice do you give your fans, some of which are aspiring writers?
This is a great question. I have lots of advice. My first piece of advice is always don't call yourself aspiring if you're a writer. Just do it. You might be pre-agented, pre-published. That's fine. You're emerging. But if you're writing, you're a writer. Another big piece of advice, which you will hear from everyone, but there's a reason for that because it's great advice, is read a lot. Read a lot in the age category and the genre that you want to be writing in. It's important to sort of get your feel for what is out there and where you might fit into that market yourself. And then also read a lot outside of that age category and genre. I pick up on so many things in like the food nonfiction books that I read, or like, you know, other forms of media that I'm taking in that have nothing to do with what I'm writing, end up showing up and informing my work in really like interesting ways. So yeah, just immerse yourself. What about you, Karen? What kind of advice would you give to up and coming writers?
Yeah, I mean, those are great. And that's definitely a couple of the things I always say. I also tell people, as best you can, to find critique partners like Kit and I are, you know, people, writers who are at the same stage of the publication journey as you. So, you know, for us, that was like, okay, we're like trying to get an agent out here. Because you know, people who are further ahead of you are probably not going to have as much time to devote as people at the same journey. And, you know, now that we're being published all the time, we're like being cautious of each other's deadlines and things like that. But also just giving and receiving feedback is, for me, it was the best way that I grew my own craft, because I didn't know what I needed to work on until somebody told me in a very nice way. And also reading other people's work really helped me understand what was working for me as a reader, you know, and then I could apply that to my own work. So if you can find people, I found all my critique partners online, just through social media and sort of trial and error type thing. But exchanging work is just so helpful when you're trying to grow as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Also really great advice. Okay, I think that's it for audience questions. So now is the point where I am supposed to remind you of the book. So I Killed Zoe Spanos is available at Barnes & Noble store locations. There are signed copies all over the greater Pittsburgh area. This first printing all has these amazing blue sprayed edges. And it's available 24/7 at Barnes & Noble online. And The Cousins is also available for pre-order now through Barnes & Noble online. So get your pre-order in now, and then you will be so excited in December when you forgot you ordered it and it arrives to you. So yeah, thank you so much, Karen, for joining me for this book club discussion. This has been
That was so fun. Thank you for sharing all this great information about the book, and thanks to everybody who was online and asked questions. Sorry we can't see you in person, but it was great to be able
we know you're
to have
here,
a conversation with you.
and we feel the love. And thank you so much to Barnes & Noble for selecting I Killed Zoe Spanos for the book club and for hosting us for this really fun book club discussion.
Yeah.